You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by Han Solo. That's right, we're starting off the year with a friend to all Wookiees, except maybe Black Chrysanthemum. Go watch Boba Fett if you want to see some of those crazy eyes. But we're back for a new year, and we hope folks will be back in the future. But this time, I kind of lost track of time when we were planning it, so nobody's on the show with me this time. But that's okay, because we're going to have some fun stuff to talk about. This is going to be a shorter one because we don't have guests, and also just a light amount of news over the holidays. This is taking stories from before the Christmas break and then after New Year's. So there's a little bit of a shortage of stories that I wanted to talk about and that were popular from the newsletter, and so we're ready to go. This is episode 103. We are in session. And as you all know, before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts, if it's working. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and subscribing means you get both Mondays at the Overhead Wire and Talking Headways on the same feed, 2 fun podcasts, 1 great channel. So thanks to the folks who subscribe through podcatchers. We really appreciate it. It's awesome that you guys keep coming back to the show. We really, really do appreciate it. So let's get started. Here's the news. Here are a few stories that piqued our interest from the newsletter over the last few weeks, or actually from before, like I said, before Christmas and after Christmas. Here are a few of the items from the news that before we get to our discussion. So I do want to say that, as I always say, these news items come from the Overhead Wire Daily, which is our newsletter, and we've been doing it now since 2006. So I think that's 16 years. I think it's 22 now, right? So 16 years. It's amazing. We've been doing the newsletter for a long time. I've really, really had fun doing it. We're going to keep doing it as long as we possibly can. But if you all want to get a free trial of the newsletter, go to theoverheadwire.com and click on the button at the top right of the show. I mean, of the website, actually, I should say. I keep mixing my promotions up and check it out. We go through about 1,500 news items every day. We pull out the 30 or so we think are the most interesting in 5 different categories, and it's really a lot of interesting news and information. Today, there was actually a really interesting piece in the Los Angeles Times about a green ride-hailing company, or actually just group of folks in the Central Valley in California who are using EVs to get their neighbors and friends around to the places where they need to go. So really cool stuff in there. All right, so let's get started. What to do with vacant storefronts. Retail was struggling before the pandemic as e-commerce business took away from brick and mortar locations, but the pandemic has tightened the screws even harder, and landlords have had to get creative in order to rent out space. Some have allowed more advertising and art, while others have turned to leasing to nonprofits and pop-ups, or creating more flexible alternatives to their usual long-term leases. This is by James Margulie in the New York Times. So I think I mentioned this in a newsletter last week, but I would really love to do something fun with a storefront. There's a storefront up the hill here from me in Noe Valley that is, there's a really interesting history. Actually, there was a guy who used to work there. I think he was Palestinian, and we used to go in there and he'd tell us these crazy stories about how he was running munitions between Israel and Palestine. And I don't know if I should believe him or not, but he had some crazy stories. But he owned a corner store, and a couple of years later, after I moved in, I think they left, and then there was a fancy clothing store and then some other stuff. But then now it's empty. It's been empty for the last few years. I think they wanted to be a dispensary for a little while, but then the pandemic started, and so there's nothing there. But I would love to take over that space, the windows in there, and put some trains in there, or put some a podcast studio or something, because the windows are really big and it's super fun. Seems like it would be really cool to do, and it seems like a lot of those types of the empty vacant storefronts, you could actually activate a lot of space around here, especially in Noe Valley, but around the city as well, since there's a number of vacancies. Obviously, the reason why there's some vacancies are multiple, partially because of the high rents that landlords are charging, partially because of the pandemic, partially because of some regulations related to what kind of stores can go in there, how much it costs to get into a San Francisco storefront. There's all kinds of stuff. I know we had an election this last time to try to like alleviate some of the problems with that, but it still seems like an issue. But I also must say that though that there were a lot of vacancies pre-pandemic. I used to walk down Valencia Street and be able to point out to places that I felt like were money laundering fronts, or even on 24th Street where the owners were just, like I said, asking way too much for rent. Somebody's asking $8,500 a month for a place, and I'm sure they've owned it for so many years. They pay so little property tax on it, they could just hold on to it and wait for a tenant. But and that's why I was also bummed out about the split roll didn't pass too, and that we recently had that election here in California. And here in California, obviously Prop 13 is messy with property taxes and all that goes along with that. But there were some companies selling, doing crazy stuff. Like they were selling 49% of a share in a skyscraper so that the buyer could keep the property tax benefit because it was so lucrative. And I just really wish that we would have kept that, we would have passed the split roll for that reason. There's all kinds of crazy stuff. Industrial land was partially owned by the previous owners or in a trust or something like that, so that they could get the tax breaks from it. All these things, when we probably could have used that money in some form or fashion for schools or anything else. So, that would have been really helpful. But I digress. There's a whole lot of stuff going on with Prop 13 and split rolls in commercial spaces. But one of the stunning things about this article specifically was the 10-year lease requirement that was seemingly a norm in the past and maybe still a norm. And I'm sure the folks that are, do commercial real estate or something like that are listening to this and saying, yeah, that's just the normal thing. But it seems like, to me, as somebody on the outside, it seems like such a huge amount of time. I looked up a 10-year lease in Google, and I think I need to actually have a show on the topic because it's been changed by a lot by co-working spaces, other technology changes as well, different, the WeWork phenomena, et cetera, pre-pandemic, obviously, and so now the pandemic. But it's just really interesting to see what the standards are in other industries, et cetera. So really interesting to see and hear about that specifically, and how that's actually being changed because of the pandemic. But maybe it's not being changed that much because there's all this technology stuff going on with storefronts, leasing spaces, et cetera, and especially with all the cloud kitchens and all the things that are happening. I just wanted something to activate all this space. So I felt like this piece was really interesting. It was kind of going through all of the things that these landlords were doing to try to get tenants. I really appreciate them opening up things to mom and pops and to nonprofits. You really don't need to, go and get another Chipotle or anything else like that, unless there's a food need in the neighborhood. I don't know, but it just seems like something that, you could open up all these little stores and these people could have an opportunity to do something really cool with the space, whether it's a train or not. All right, next up. Stop operating transit like a for-profit business. So operator shortages continue to be a problem at transit agencies across the country. Former MBTA employee Laurel believes that the part of the problem is treating transit agencies too much like a business, hiring MBAs with no transit experience into upper-level positions where they then cut costs. This strategy is part of a broader trend that contributes to inequality by limiting workplace mobility. This was by Laurel Paget-Seekins in her blog, Laurel in Transit. Now, Laurel, I think, recently moved to the Bay Area, which is really cool. I hope we get to chat with her at some point, have her back on the show, because she's been on the show before, which was really cool to talk about data and what she was doing at the MBTA a number of years ago. But this is a really interesting piece, and I really liked her argument. And I know that she was maybe a little surprised about, her talking about her dating and what leads to what she talks about on her dates at the first part of the post and how that got there. But it was really just fascinating thinking about what she's talking about specifically, which is a lot of these transit agencies are hiring MBAs to do a lot of the mid-level, high-level stuff, and it ends up doing something like, splitting the employment base in half. And so that the drivers and the folks that are doing the work on the street, they don't feel like the management is listening to them or understands them because they're not one of them, and those types of things. So one of the things that her arguments were talking about was that transit agencies need to allow more upward mobility, or else you're going to continue to have worker shortages because it feels like there's a dead end. Even with the amazing benefits and long-term security of working for a public agency, that's just something that is kind of gone by the wayside. There's a part of the American dream that's getting squashed out here and all over the business landscape, in fact. And she talked about in her post, which was the article that she was reading actually, and what she would talk about with their now partner, was that, there's a difference between Apple and Kodak, and who could start as a janitor and end up being the CEO versus how that's possible at other companies now, how it was possible back in the day, but now how it isn't really possible now. And I think that, like I said, that's part of the American dream that's getting kind of squashed. Businesses aren't really hiring companies. I mean, businesses aren't companies. Businesses aren't really hiring employees, I should say, for the long run anymore. There's a start at the bottom and pay your dues kind of mentality that was early on, and when I was starting to work, even in the 90s, that it's possible that you could have worked for a number of these companies, and then you could become CEO if you worked hard enough, if you're smart enough, if you kind of put yourself in the right position. But it feels like more and more these days we're putting up walls around upper paying jobs, and you can't really break into those jobs unless you're from a certain establishment, school or community, or you're looking to cut costs. Also, hiring people that have zero experience in a transit board might be okay, as Christoph Spieler says last week in our podcast with transit boards with Grace Kruniken and Monica Tibbetts-Nutt, because they bring other things to the table, like the ability to understand contracts better, or numbers, or bookkeeping, those types of things. But if they are just out there to cut costs, like it seems like a lot of MBAs or management consultants do, and as Laurel describes in the piece, then that's a short-term solution with a balloon payment somewhere down the road that we don't want to see. So also, I also want to reiterate that transportation should be about access, not necessarily business. And it's a utility, a public service. And, you want to have them be smart about spending public dollars. Absolutely, we do. Fiscal sanity is very important. But we also know that transportation unlocks all other parts of the economy like a utility does. It's not just a widget to sell, which is a really important point. So I think that's something that we need to think about. And a lot of these agencies, and a lot of public agencies even, are trying to run like a business, and the politics of it all is crazy because people want you to run like a business because you want to be fiscally responsible, et cetera. But ultimately, some of these things aren't businesses. They're just public utilities, and they're important. So I think that's a really important point. And I urge people to go read this as normal. All of these articles will be in the show notes, so go check it out if you get a chance. Okay, next up, pick a side of the street, or pick a side street. In many cities across the U.S., more intense development happens on the busiest streets. Author Henry Grabar argues that results in unjust outcomes in which multifamily residents are forced to act as a buffer for low-density side streets, bearing the brunt of problems like traffic, noise, and air pollution. He argues side streets should be upzoned to make way for more apartments. This was by Henry Grabar in Slate. You all know Henry. He writes some great pieces in Slate, which is a great publication. So when I was writing the notes for this initially, I wrote down this really long discussion, and I went into this arguments about this and that and the other thing. And I don't really have anybody here to debate it with, so I'm going to have to leave it for listeners after a little bit of shorter remarks. I will say, in my shorter remarks, that if we do build apartments in multifamily buildings everywhere on the blocks and the avenues and the arterials and side streets, the problem is still cars. Are arterial buildings an environmental justice issue? Yes, because of cars and streets designed for speed, and electric cars aren't going to solve that problem. As Donald Shoup noted in the article, planning this way is about parking specifically, who can park where. Parking seems to be the dominant planning, methodology these days, with the NIMBYs and all the discussions around not allowing people to live near them because they're worried about traffic. They're worried about whether they can park their car, whether they have access to their housing, et cetera. They're worried about density, et cetera. I'd go a step further than saying it's about parking, and I want to say it's about cars and street design. Because in the article, Henry discusses noise pollution, traffic collisions, dusty windowsills. I think those are all environmental justice issues. Those are all issues of who gets put near places where there's a lot of environmental degradation. There's a lot of opportunity to get impacts from air pollution, air quality issues, other issues, noise pollution, et cetera, like I mentioned, that don't necessarily go into the quieter neighborhoods. But also that all comes from automobiles and driving and fast speeds and all those things. There's pictures in the article, actually, of places in Spain and in other countries around the world that are narrower streets but tall buildings. And I feel like that's because we're putting we're putting the car last instead of the car first. So we talk about putting stuff on arterials. There is there's something to be said about commercial activity all being concentrated in a space, concentrated in a core. So Obviously, there's an issue, but it has a lot to do with corridor design, with street design, with the way that we allow vehicles to kind of monopolize our transportation. And I think if you have subway networks, like a lot of the larger cities around the world, that are positive in this result in terms of having density in neighborhoods as well as on the side streets and on the arterial streets, I think you'll find that people have better access just because they have access to the subway and don't have to worry about getting in their car and going other places. So the core cities, the ones that you hear nowadays are closing their streets to traffic and trying to limit the number of cars even more, those are the ones with good transportation networks. And, I think that there's less of an environmental justice issue there, even though there are still cars and there are still, negative impacts of those types of things. So I'd love to hear your opinions on this because there's a larger discussion about preserving single-family neighborhoods going on, at least on housing and transportation Twitter, that I didn't really want to get into today. And I started to, and then I was like, I don't want to start this this discussion here without other people because I think I need to kind of a back and forth on this one specifically. So theoverheadwire@gmail.com. I want to hear your thoughts on this. I'm interested. I do think that putting people on arterials is not the best, and even especially freeways. I think that's another thing that we've done. We have a discussion between a 2-lane street, a 4-lane arterial, and then a highway. And the highways are the worst ones. And I think LA has shown that this is a bad deal. They put a lot of apartments and housing near the highways, and there's been a lot of discussion about that's being a bad deal for a long time. That's where to put the multifamily housing, which is not true. So I want to hear your thoughts, theoverheadwire@gmail.com. And then finally, this is my last one for today, fits and starts. So Tri-Rail, a commuter rail line which operates in the Miami region, will not be able to go into the new Brightline terminal in Miami because the platforms won't fit the train cars. The Tri-Rail move into downtown, which is expected to cost $70 million, is already 4 years late, and now there are even more concerns about whether the train cars are too heavy to travel across the viaduct into the station as they were built to HSR specifications. So this was by Douglas Hank. It's in the Miami Herald right before the holidays. I remember when this came out. So this is all kinds of history stuff going on. But, Tri-Rail is likely from the era of the Federal Railroad Administration, regulating railroads, and they regulated railroads and passenger railroads. They made sure that they were crash worthy. If they crashed into a freight train, they wouldn't telescope and kill all the people inside. And so they're heavier trains and have a different weight standard. And so that's one of the things that we have been fighting about over the last 10, 15, 20 years is, the weight of trains, how fast, how, heavy should they be? How light should they be? What are the crash standards? Why are we worried about trains crashing into each other? Partially because it's a freight-dominated system that we have here in the United States. And so that's one of the things that we've been talking about on and off for a long time. And it's funny that it keeps coming up. It keeps happening to where we have to have these discussions every once in a while because of the train differences between the new standards and the standards that Europe uses versus our standards here for commuter rail. The other thing that was interesting about this is that the platform would hit the steps that are coming off the car exit doors on the train cars. So for Tri-Rail. So a report from the railroad consultants firm blames the issue on the platforms not being built per the design plans and specifications, and says either the platforms would need to be modified, including the removal of concrete and rebar for their entire length, or the Tri-Rail cars would need modifications to change where the steps come. I mean, I don't really have much to say about this one, aside from that we really, really need to coordinate planning between entities and stop some of these kind of mix-ups. It seems like this happens every once in a while, whether it's the tracks were laid wrong or they're in the wrong, they have the wrong gauge, or they didn't have the rubber. I think it was the Seattle. They laid all the tracks in the tunnel, and they had to redo it because they hadn't laid down the rubber between the tracks and the concrete to make sure that the electricity didn't jump and those types of things. So, there's all these like little tiny engineering things that pop. And it's not, it's not just rail. It's like building a Transbay terminal that needs to wasn't inspected correctly or whatever. And so they have to go back and figure out how to fix that. So there's all these little engineering mistakes we continue to make. I mean, we have a building falling down basically here in San Francisco because somebody decided that it was okay not to. They were the smartest person in the room, and they decided that they were too smart for everybody else, and they didn't need pilings that went into the bedrock in an earthquake zone. So now we're listing 3 inches per year or whatever it is. So they're fixing that now, and it's a mess, but that's a whole other story in itself. But just like all these engineering fixes and madness, you'd think that somebody would have caught on to something and thought about it when they were checking it out. But maybe there's only one or two little elves that check those things. So something to keep in mind when you're planning, for future rail lines or for commuter rail lines, or doing some of these things, you need to make sure all the standards and everything are exactly the same so that they're on the same page, because it's a real mess when you have to fix those things. So that's in Miami. That was the Miami Herald talking about that. I'm interested to see what happens. Which way do you think they choose? Do you think they choose taking the steps off the trains, or do you think they choose changing the platforms completely? I can't imagine which one's more expensive. They're both kind of are bad decisions and bad choices. So it's something interesting. All right. And that's it for this week. I know it's kind of a short one. A couple of articles, a couple of things here, a couple of things there, but we'll get in and out and get you some information and get you on your way, and then wait up for the next time when we come back with another hour episode, because I really enjoy having folks on to talk about stuff. But this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without it, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic, so we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month and you'll get some stickers, and $10 a month and you'll get our bus-only scarf. The bus-only scarf is sold out from the store, but you can still get one if you are supportive on Patreon. So go do the $10 a month supporter and you can get one of the scarves. I have a number of left that I saved for Patreon supporters, so check it out if you get a chance. Also, I do want to mention that we did produce an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning and Practice. If you want to get your hands on one, go to raymondunwin.com. It's sitting at the top of the list of APA's planning books that you need to read. So go check that out. 100 Essential Books of Planning. It's on the top, APA. I thought that would be a fun book to go back to 1909 and see what they're saying. And, Raymond had some good ideas. And so I thought that would be fun to make that into an audiobook. It's not very long. It's only, it's not like one of those 2, 3, 4 hour books. It's, 40-hour books is what I meant. I think it's only like 7 hours or something like that. So it's really short. The reader is amazing. And I hope that folks will go to raymondunwin.com and check it out. And finally, listener questions and comments. If you have a comment or question, feel free to tweet at us or comment on any of the social sites where the podcast appears, or feel free to email us at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. Definitely email me what your ideas are on zoning. And I know some of you have ideas about Calthorpe and the El Camino Real situation and things like that. I've seen this when I've been tweeted. I think it was the Cliff Bar who tweeted that at me. But yeah, send me a note and let me know what you think. I'm interested to hear what people think about whether it's cars and street design, or whether it's something that has to do with clustering people, and something that's been done for 5,000 years, and transportation patterns been built around up until the early 1900s when cars started taking over. We built cities a certain way, and wide streets, etc. So interesting to hear what people think. All right, Puppies and Butterflies is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in other sections. I'm just happy there's sunshine, more sunshine. Every day is a couple more minutes. We've had a bit of rain, and I really appreciate that too here in California. But we've been doing some fun stuff around the house too. I guess watching the kids' baking championship on Food Network, watching Netflix stand-ups, watching the Book of Boba Fett. Obviously, I'm a Star Wars. Everybody who's listening to the show and knows I'm a Star Wars fan. So we took down all of our Christmas decorations too. So that made me a bit bummed out, but maybe we can put some decorations up before next fall. Does anybody know if Valentine's Day, if anybody has like stuff for that? Do you put up red lights and hearts on the windows instead of wreaths and snowflakes? Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe that's something I might try this year. To throw a little love out there onto the street. maybe that would create a few more puppies and butterflies for folks. So anyways, thanks for listening this week. You can find me on Twitter at The Overhead Wire or at theoverheadwire.com. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for sponsoring this week's podcast. Thanks to Han Solo for being with me with the Canton. And we will see you with our guests next time.
Talking Monday.